All right, well, good morning and welcome and TGIF. I don't know about you all, but it's been a pretty busy week for most of us, so that feels good. And I'm excited to have you all join us. My name is Victoria Boundy. I'm with Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, and it occurs to me I didn't specify that in my next to my title or my name here, but I'll do that later. All of you can take advantage of that opportunity to tell us where you're from as well. So welcome again. This is our second workshop in the Funding Climate Resilience and Stormwater series. Casco Bay Estuary Partnership is organizing this series along with our partners, New England Environmental Finance Center, Martha Shiels, and Nathan Robbins from the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, and many other folks, and we'll get a chance to hear from them in a moment. Casco Bay Estuary Partnership is part of a national estuary program focused on protecting and restoring Casco Bay. We get our core funding from EPA. So this is a pilot series, and we had our first workshop, and I recognize a lot of the people on this that have entered this room. Our first one was back in August. It was called Navigating Grant Programs. And in that first session, we heard from state funders who fund climate resilience and stormwater programs. And we also heard from local communities that successfully navigated those programs. And then most importantly, we heard from everyone at that meeting in breakout rooms about opportunities and challenges that you all face in both planning and funding your resilience programs. So for this workshop, we've taken your input. I emailed out yesterday a document, and we apologize for sending it so late, but hopefully you've had a chance to review it. But what we did was we took all of the input from the first workshop and collated it, and pretty much, we didn't do a whole lot of editing, honestly. And we divided it up into 3 buckets, one for local municipal officials, one for state funders, and the third for the Maine Climate Council. And we'll be looking at that more today. So today we will, I don't know if we want to put up the agenda. Thank you. We will be hearing from representatives of the Maine Climate Council and the draft climate action framework that is being put together as we speak, and will be finalized shortly. So we'll be hearing from those speakers. We'll get a chance to ask them questions. Then we will do a little bit of review from the groundwork that we set in workshop 1, and then go back into breakout rooms and have you provide us with further input. This is kind of a bonus workshop in our series. We recognize that communities are, seeking and funding seeking funding for proposals every day, and you're hard at work on this every day. So in our next workshop towards the end of the year, we want to get back to sort of some basics and nitty-gritty of how to craft successful proposals. So how to find the right technical assistance, how to enlist community partners in your effort. So we'll get back to that. But, in the meantime, we wanted to ride the wave of the Maine Climate Council and its momentum. It's been a really groundbreaking process, and it's been held up as a model in other parts of the country. I've been on a couple webinars where it was cited for its work. So we're very fortunate to have that process going on right now. And we wanted to give you all yet another opportunity to hear more about the work that the Climate Council is doing and give you an opportunity to shape future initiatives so that work can trickle down to communities and really help you to move forward. So let's take the next couple of minutes to introduce the rest of the project team. How about Martha? Do you want to kick that off?
Sorry, I was on mute. Good morning. My name is Martha Shiels, and I'm with the New England Environmental Finance Center, and really happy to be part of this amazing group of organizers for such an important theme. So welcome and thank you.
Okay, then Nathan.
Good morning. Great to be with everybody, and I will second that, Martha. It's a great project team to be part of. I'm here with Maine DEP as the climate change specialist. I've been spending a lot of time working on the council and also on the Maine Climate Council, and also working to coordinate resources and do a lot of technical assistance to communities. And this is a hot topic, of course. It's already been covered. We know that this is where things get to in terms of implementation, in terms of assessing risks, in terms of outreach and education, you name it. So it's great to be with you all. Thank you for coming to join us, continue the conversation, and looking forward to later on.
Thank you, Martha and Nathan. We have such an amazing project team. We really do. And I also want to introduce to you Alan Kratz. Alan, do you want to?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. I am on the Comprehensive Plan Committee in Brooksville, and we've just formed the Select Board has just formed a new Climate Change Committee, and I've been appointed to that as well. So it's very exciting to be working at the municipal level, and also I've been observing the work of the Maine Climate Council, very impressed with the forward-thinking, energetic work that the council is doing. This is going to be a good workshop today. Happy to be part of it.
Thank you, Alan. Let me also mention that we have Tam Mittman and Leah Soloway of the New England Environmental Finance Center, and they're those silent partners that do so much of the work, and they're tech hosts for us today. And finally, I want to recognize Chris Smith of Headwaters Economics, who I think is on the call, and also Abby Hall, who's in the Community Revitalization Office at EPA. They're new colleagues of ours, and they provided us with some examples of best practices that we incorporated into those guidance documents along with your input and sent out to you yesterday. So thank you to them. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Nathan to talk about the Maine Climate Council work and introduce our presenters.
Great, thanks. Victoria. So we'll jump in here with our next item. Want to welcome Brian Ambrett, who is a Senior Climate Resilience Coordinator at the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and Future, and to Christina Ford, who's a member of the Climate Council, and to Representative Lydia Bloom, also a member of the Maine Climate Council. We're going to spend the next hour here covering the draft action framework with a focus on adaptation and hazard mitigation strategies that are under consideration by Maine. Brian's going to start us off with a presentation to get some of the groundwork out there about where we're at in that process and what are some of the funding strategies that are currently under discussion, and then cover a little bit more about what they could mean to communities. So I just want to say thank you right up front to our presenters, and we'll follow with some Q&A. So please just be sure to jot down your questions, and if you can please hold them, I think we'll have plenty of time to get to many of them. So Brian, I'm going to hand it over to you, and thanks again, and you have control.
Thanks, Nathan. Pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Thanks to Nathan, Martha, and Victoria, and Alan for having me this morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. And also thank you to Leah, who is driving the slideshow for me today. So Leah, let's go to the next slide and get started. We're here to talk today about climate change, but I think it's really important that we acknowledge that the COVID-19 crisis is still ongoing in our communities, and that the pandemic is really front of mind for us. And it can be tempting to push climate to the back burner. But to be clear, COVID-19, while it's not a result of climate change, it is a tragic example of the kinds of multiple and overlapping crises that our communities and states will face in a climate-altered future. These crises cannot be ignored, and they won't be solved without collective action. Furthermore, like COVID-19, the climate change has an outsized negative impact on the people with the least means to protect themselves, especially our poor and marginalized communities. And the Climate Council is tasked with ensuring that our most vulnerable communities are prioritized and the benefits of new policies or programs are equitably distributed. Next slide, please. When Governor Mills came to office, she made tackling climate change a priority for her administration, and she tasked the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the future with leading efforts to address climate change. But we can't do it alone, and we're lucky to have partners like DEP and the Environmental Finance Center and Casco Bay Estuary Partnership alongside us helping with this work. Most of you probably already know a bit about the Climate Council, but for those of you who don't, I'm going to do a quick flyover here before we get into the meat of the strategies that are being considered. The Council was established in 2019 through bipartisan legislation. It was tasked with producing a statewide climate action plan every 4 years. So this is not our only bite at the apple, it's just our first. Next slide, please. And next slide. Thanks. The same legislation established ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets, and it included instructions to ensure that the state builds resilience to the impacts of climate change. The Council is charged with developing the plan to meet these goals and targets, and that plan is due in the first version to the legislature and the governor on December 1st. Next slide. The Council itself is made up of 39 members. We're fortunate to have 2 of them with us here today. It's an assembly of scientists, industry leaders, bipartisan local and state officials, and it's responsible, as I said, for developing that climate action plan every 4 years. You can see the 6 working groups here on this slide that contributed a ton of recommendations over the last winter, spring, and early summer. They were supported by a science and technical committee that really grounded the process in science. And so in all, there's about 250 people who have been contributing through the Climate Council process to the recommendations and the strategies that are on the table today and that we'll talk about in a minute. Next slide. There have been some other streams of information that have come in and complemented those recommendations from the working groups. And I'm going to move through these fairly quickly right now, but they're all available on the climatecouncil.maine.gov website. Next slide. The first is a climate science report by the Science and Technical Working Group. It's a 400-page document that really digs in on all of the impacts of climate change that we're experiencing in Maine and in the Gulf of Maine. And it has a number of important recommendations like this one about committing to manage probably the best estimate of what sea level rise will look like in 2050 and 2100. But then also encouraging any kind of decision maker to prepare to manage for a worst case scenario. And this is particularly important if you have critical infrastructure or other kinds of assets that just absolutely need to function no matter what. So this is a kind of recommendation that's coming out of the science report and will be front and center in the climate plan. Next slide. We had a contractor of the Eastern Research Group do an extensive analysis, economic analysis of the vulnerabilities that the state faces, what the costs of doing nothing more or just carrying out existing policy will be. And this is an important baseline of information against what actually, there's no free ride here, right? So there are costs to doing nothing. And it's important to have that baseline so that when we look at the greenhouse gas modeling and the economic analysis of what a package or a plan might cost, we have something useful to compare it to. Next slide. We worked with the University of Maine's Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions on an equity assessment. So they looked at all of the strategies that came in from the working groups, passed them through an equity screen, and really made some important suggestions for how to improve those strategies so that they were more equitable, not only in their outcomes, but also in the participation and the input that goes into those strategies. Next slide. There is a clean energy economy plan in progress right now, and this is a plan to help build the green energy economy in Maine, help build green jobs in Maine. And as I said, this is in progress, but The executive summary in draft form is available again on that website, climatecouncil.maine.gov, and this is what the Climate Council is going to be digging into next week in its next meeting. Next slide. And lastly, there was a very robust virtual stakeholder engagement process that happened over the summer and early fall. We had an online survey that folks could take via the website, and we received over 4,000 responses to that survey from about 3/4 of the zip codes in Maine. We also did targeted outreach to particular groups, and in particular, some of the vulnerable groups around the state. And then we received over 300 pages worth of comments and letters from folks around and organizations around the state. So there's been a lot of feedback that has gone into the process alongside of the recommendations that came out of the working group. Next slide, please. So what did the working groups share with us? And these have been repackaged slightly into some buckets that make a little bit more sense from a narrative perspective for the plan. I'm not going to sit here and read all of these to you. You can scan over them yourselves, but what you will see as you do that is that there is a number of themes that pop up. And this slide shows all of the strategies that are related to climate mitigation, or reducing the greenhouse gases that cause climate change. Those themes are using less energy through energy efficiency means, electrifying those things that need to switch off of fossil fuels, so that's heating our homes and buildings, and our transportation, moving towards things that rely on the grid rather than rely on fossil fuels. And then lastly, cleaning the grid, so that the energy that goes onto the grid is cleaner, is more renewable, and that we're reducing our greenhouse gases through a combination of all three of these themes. Next slide. So this slide is really, I think, the meat of our discussion today. These are the strategies or the recommendations from the working groups that talk about preparing for the climate change impacts that we know are coming and that in some cases are already unavoidable. And so, again, I'll let you scan through these and I'll highlight some themes. The first is a theme of science and monitoring, that we need to be able to measure what it is that's happening in the environment around us and in our communities. The second is providing technical assistance so that whether it's communities or landowners or business owners, that folks are getting the assistance they need, and particularly are getting the information and the guidance they need to make decisions about how to respond and how to plan to the climate impacts that they're seeing or that they anticipate. The third theme is really promoting nature-based solutions. These are the solutions that perhaps it's green infrastructure or it's conservation, but using nature as much as possible and natural systems to do some of the work for us, provide ecosystem services where necessary and where possible. And because of that, they are capable of saving communities money, and often they are have a better survivability, whether we're talking about storms or intense rain or what have you. And then lastly, the theme around updating state laws and programs. A lot of the, for example, land use tools that we have on the books were designed before climate change was really a threat. And so they need to be updated and made useful in the climate era. If we look across all 6 buckets going between this slide and the previous one, there are some other themes that pop out as well. One is workforce development opportunities, and the other is education and awareness building. And then the third, which I'm going to spend a little bit more time on, is thinking about funding, innovative financing, and incentives. Those 3 things sort of as a package. How do we pay for all of this work? So if you can go to the next slide, Leah. I've just highlighted, oh, go up one, please. Thanks. I've highlighted here the strategies in the preparing for climate change impacts part of the plan that would have some financing or technical assistance aspects show up in them. And so let's go into more detail on the next slide, Leah. So starting with planning and land use, the Resilience Working Group spent a lot of time thinking about how to expand the state's capacity for technical assistance to communities. And this can show up in the form of guidance documents, helping communities select practices for the hazards and the threats that they anticipate, and then the assistance to put plans together and execute those plans. There's a good deal of talk about increasing the funding to incentivize incorporating climate resilience into local and regional plans, regulations, capital improvement plans, for example, and incentivizing regional cooperation for resilience planning, trying to leverage capacity across multiple communities and build good practices there for regional collaboration. Third is reviewing, as I said, reviewing and revising land use tools to make them useful in the climate era. This could include comprehensive plans, shoreline zoning, floodplain management, stormwater management, low impact design ordinances, site law, coastal dune rules, just to name a few. And as those are updated and revised, implementing those with training for planners and code enforcement officers so that they know how to use those tools and know what changes have been made. There's a good deal of emphasis on, as I said, using incentives, and particularly to incentivize regional capacity and cooperation. And the work group recommended specific modifications to things like TIFs, tax increment financing, to implement resilience projects, and cited a number of examples from Rhode Island and Massachusetts where bonds were used for resilience funding. As we get down into implementation and infrastructure, there's a recommendation that a state infrastructure adaptation fund be created. This would really help communities and state agencies meet the federal cost share requirements that are often burdensome and preventative for some local infrastructure projects. And that could be combined with incentives for towns that have hazard mitigation plans or climate action plans, or are members of the National Flood Insurance Program or the community rating system, where the types of work that go into creating those plans and participating in those programs are actually increasing resilience and should be rewarded in some way as towns apply for funding from this infrastructure fund. Along with that fund, again, goes assistance, and this time it's in the form of project pre-development, thinking about how local and state infrastructure projects could benefit from assistance with engineering, permitting, and developing the capital stacks to get projects to a shovel-ready point where they're ready for either federal grants or private investment. Thinking about a working waterfront infrastructure fund was something that the Coastal and Marine Working Group came up with. Work groups recommended working with existing loan funds like Clean Water State Revolving Funds and the Municipal Construction Grant Program, and with existing entities like the Finance Authority of Maine and the Maine Municipal Bond Bank. So not trying to reinvent wheels here, but using institutions that we have already and tweaking them in some ways to make them more friendly for climate practices. And Rhode Island is a great example of this, where they took a comprehensive look at all of their state funding programs related to water or the environment, and made them useful, not just tweaking, but made them really useful for implementing climate resilience and climate resilient practices. On the conservation and environment side, recommendations around increasing funding for conservation via the Land for Maine's Future Fund, including resilience and scoring criteria for state grant programs, increasing assistance to towns for IF&Ws beginning with habitat and Department of Agriculture's natural areas programs, increasing funding for Stream Smart Crossings grant program and the Coastwise Tidal Crossings program, and even the temporary steel bridge cost share program. So a lot of thinking here about using existing grant programs and tweaking those and making them useful in the climate era. And I've covered this last bullet here already, but leveraging existing grant funding programs and revising the scoring criteria for programs that include climate resilience. Next slide, Leah. So that's it. The Climate Council has its next meeting next Wednesday on October 21st. It's in the morning from 9 to noon. You're welcome to join. You can sign up at climatecouncil.maine.gov and see the list of meetings. There's only 2 meetings left, so we're, as Victoria said, we're closing in here on the final versions of the plan. And I look forward to some questions with you after our next two speakers. Thanks very much.
That was great, Brian. Thank you so much. A huge overview to have to cover in a short few minutes, and really appreciate you covering the process and really getting into some of those details around what are the specific funding things, that sources, mechanisms, strategies that we're really talking about here. It's certainly a big list, and some exciting conversations to come. I hope people do tune in next week to the next council meeting. I want to say, again, thank you to Representative Bloom. I'm going to go here to you next, and if you could, as a member of the Climate Council, as a representative, you're working in the town of York. I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit more to what this might mean to communities, speaking from those roles, and start to sort of transition us a little bit more to some of the questions that I think folks are having here today. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Nathan. Thank you for inviting me. And I just want to say something about the Climate Council process. It's been very impressive. The group that Brian is a part of in the governor's office has been incredibly professional and hardworking, and so helpful to us on the Climate Council. I really think that we're going to have a very successful end to our work over this past year and a half. And I wanted to just thank Brian especially for his work on the resilience side. Yes, I represent the coastal portion of the town of York in southern Maine, and we have we rely on our coastal tourism. We rely so much on our beaches that it's very real to us what's happening on our coast, and we've been at the forefront, the town has, of addressing sea level rise in their comprehensive plan early on in, I think, 2012, and has grown from there. And there's been a lot of good community awareness of it. People are actually looking at maps and freaking out that the lighthouse will be cut off. So there's I think the community is very much behind the work that this town is doing. And I think that the Climate Council's the Resiliency Working Group talk about what towns can do, and what they should be doing is building upon existing organizations. So we're very lucky here in southern Maine that we have the Southern Maine Planning Corporation in Sanford, who does a lot of work for these towns in this area. And instead of, one of the examples is instead of hiring a sustainability expert just for the town of York, there were 5 towns that got together and hired one person to be their sustainability coordinator for all of those towns. And I think it's really worked. I met with my town manager, and they seem to be very happy with how things are working out, how it was very manageable in terms of budgeting for. And I'm hearing about, I heard about the climate adaptation committees that are being formed by towns. So it sounds like lots of good things are already happening, and it's really exciting. And I hope that that other towns will look for regional opportunities. What towns can they work with? Because in terms of everything is sort of interconnected, especially when it comes to climate change and transportation and all of that. And so I think it's I hope that's something that we're going to build on. As a state representative, I'm thinking about what are we going to do coming in January? As a legislator, what can we do to help such things? What are the first things that we need to do? So that's what I'm thinking also on the Climate Council as we look at all these recommendations. What is the timing of this? We've got to be bold. We've got to act quickly. So we have to do everything we can as much as we can. And the So I'm one of the things that I'm thinking about is that using this example of Southern Maine planning, how do we strengthen all the other regional planning organizations that exist, or in some cases don't even exist, and kind of use this as a model for other parts of the state. You know, I've been very focused on coastal issues, but this planning would be for all of the region. I mean, all of the areas, including non-coastal towns. So anyway, that's kind of we've had a lot of success here in York. I feel we're on a good track. You know, but you know, what's going to work? This whole one of the emphasis of the Climate Council is really talking about natural resilience. How do we use nature as a form of resilience? We can't just put seawalls up, for example. We've got to be able to incentivize that kind of approach. And you know, and that's about land conservation. It's about buying land. It's about conserving marshes and allowing marshes to migrate and all sorts of things that, you know, are very, very complicated at first, but is really the best resilience strategy in terms of actually combating the effects of climate change. So I would like to know a little bit more about that. I mean, I want to hear what other people would say about that. Some of the towns, what do they think about this natural resilience of promoting that in their towns? So that's really all I have to say at the moment. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering any questions.
That was excellent. Thank you so much, Representative Bloom. Yeah, one of the things that just really spoke to me was, and to our agenda today, is setting up for success. We know there's a lot of things that are being discussed, you know, that are coming down the pike. We also have a lot of examples of successes already. We can build from them. There are models, and there are actions that are being taken that maybe could be scaled. And there's some more focus on specific areas you touched on. Thank you so much for setting us up for that. So I want to turn now to Christina Ford. Again, thank you so much for joining us as a member of the Climate Council, also as a former chair of the Select Board and East Boothbay. So just thank you, and if you could just provide maybe a few more thoughts, we would really appreciate it.
Good morning, and thank you. I wasn't the chairman. I was just a selectman.
My mistake. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. I don't want to overstate my position. I really have enjoyed what you have put together here, Nathan, because I have had the feeling that, as I said to you when you asked me to join on this session, that I don't know anything about funding. It's not my expertise. Expertise is land use, and also it is dealing with the effects of terrible climate events such as Hurricane Katrina. I was the planning director in New Orleans in the years before Hurricane Katrina. I went there after Hurricane Katrina to help. I was teaching at Columbia when Hurricane Sandy came, and I worked on the results of that and coming up with a plan for the whole region in the following year. And I was certainly around for Hurricane Irene. So a friend said to me, you shouldn't tell people where you're going to move next, because they'll be on the lookout for some terrible event. But I've been very pleased by what you're doing, because I've had the feeling in my work on the Maine Climate Council, and I'm on the resilient.
Oh, Christina, I think we might have lost your connection here for just a minute. At least that's what I'm hearing. Okay, and I'm seeing Victoria nod. So I think hopefully that comes back here in just a minute. I'll just give it a second, and if not, maybe we'll jump into some questions to start, and we'll come back to Christina as soon as her connection comes back. Okay, I think that probably sounds best. And Christina, once you join us, we'll it looks like you're going to log back in. Okay, so yeah, so I guess maybe just jumping into the Q&A here, and I guess the best way to probably do this is if folks could use the raise hand function. That's probably the easiest, and I'll sort of monitor the participant list here and try to check those. And I'll just ask Victoria and Martha if you can, and maybe Alan, if you all can help me here on this. If you see a question, or just write something in the chat box, that's great too. And either you can ask it or I'll ask it. So does anybody have any starting questions here? And I guess while those come in, and I can start. So Victoria, Martha, Alan, if you see something, just let me know. Brian, Representative Bloom, I guess, we've painted a big picture about what's going on. Some of the areas where we need to work on. I'm guessing there was a good point. I think, Brian, you mentioned there's no free ride. There's a cost of doing nothing. I really appreciate that. We have some great analysis on that. And if we manage sort of as the status quo, we have some ideas of what to expect now. That's certainly one of the, big outcomes to me that we've been able to get to in the Climate Council process, is to have some more answers to those questions. So I guess my question is maybe to you, Brian, and to you, Representative Bloom. So we have this big list. What are a few pathways to success that we might think about in terms of, let's take this sort of nature-based solutions. Do you see it as projects, funding shovel-ready projects, or is it research? Is it that we need, there's sources that we might be able to tap into? Where might we focus?
I could take a first stab at that a little bit, Lydia, and let you go after. So it's a common thing to think that the biggest barrier is the funding, and oftentimes the biggest barrier is the pipeline of projects. And it's not to say that funding isn't a challenge, but you have to have projects ready when the funding opportunity arises, right? And so that means having a pipeline with a number of projects ready to go, so that you can find the right project when the right funding opportunity arises. And so that's where the pre-development assistance really comes in, helping projects get to that shovel-ready point where all they need is the infusion of funding, and then they're ready to go. So it's not enough to think of it just as a funding problem, but it's also about all of that pre-work that's often hard to fund to get a project ready for the big grant or the big private capital investment. So I think that's been something that has really stood out to me in the last couple of months, as the Climate Council process has made its way. That we can't be thinking about financing and funding in a bubble by itself. It's got to be in conjunction with developing project pipelines.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, we respecting the process. Communities are at different points. There's a lot of things that we can do right now, even if you don't have a project that's ready, that might be a near-term step. Representative Bloom, any additional thoughts there?
I guess, I really would like to see, I want to look at real examples of what that means, natural climate solutions, who's doing it now? What can we do? I know that we've had some pilot projects, and I think that, what we're trying to do, just to step back 1 second, that we're trying to do overall is to prepare our towns so they can be in the best position to go for these very competitive things. These things are competitive, so towns have to be able to write get the write the applications and get the money. They have to have the state behind them with a good climate plan, saying that this is what we're trying to follow, and this is why we're why we should be able to get this grant or this funding. So, I mean, I think that's one of the things that we're trying to do from the state, because you've got the state to support the real work for resiliency is going to go on a local level. And so what I want to make sure that whatever we do on the state resiliency is plan is going to really help our local towns so they can have that creativity, or be able to come up with ideas that follow these really good recommendations coming out of the Climate Council. So the natural climate solutions, I'd love to hear from some members on this call. What is your opinion about that, and how do you see that working for you? I would love to hear that if people have anything to share.
That's great. Thank you, Representative Bloom. And yeah, feel free to raise your hand or share an example, add a link to a project maybe, if you're comfortable doing that in the chat box. We'd love to hear about it. So yeah, just putting that call out there. And I'm just checking here to see if Christina has come back in and joined. I'm seeing a phone number. Christina, are you on? Okay, maybe still trying to chime back in. Oh, Martha, did you have something? Yep.
Yeah, I didn't want to just start speaking. So thanks for the opportunity to comment on Representative Bloom's statements, because I think it's so important to recognize that nature-based solutions are an important tool in our toolbox to really promote climate resilience. And it's good on a lot of levels in that it preserves the Maine that we know. We want to keep those open spaces, and the challenge in that is that a lot of the space in Maine is privately owned. So we can see examples of the difficulty of conservation in the case study of the Sebago Lake watershed, and that's something that I think the Climate Council is really promoting the use of local examples, which is fantastic. The other point I wanted to make is that the nature-based solution strategy is also the cheapest one. Instead of letting development and sprawl take over, if we preserve our natural spaces, it will be the biggest return on your investment in the long run. So on a lot of levels, it has so many benefits. The other point I wanted to say that I appreciated you mentioning is regionalization. How we can save a lot of money by your example of just having one sustainability specialist for 5 towns. That is very replicable. And so examples like that are, I think, what the Climate Council should know, that those are strategies that can really be easy and have big impacts. So just thanks for those comments.
Great, thank you.
And I can see Chris Smith, you've have a question here. So go ahead, please. Yeah, unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Chris Smith here at Headwaters Economics, and we've been doing a lot of similar thinking. I think my question is for Brian. Brian, I really like your point about needing the kind of the project pipeline, and we've been thinking a lot here about kind of the local revenue side of things, and I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit how you think like raising local revenues fits into that picture. And also if you have any examples of kind of interesting ways that kind of regional groups have raised revenues kind of more from the local side as opposed to just grant and state or grants, bonds and loans. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, it's a good question. The funding, where the funding comes from for all of this work it's kind of an all of the above kind of answer, right? It's got to come from everywhere. It's got to come locally. It's got to come from the state. It's got to come from the feds. It's got to come from the private sector. There's no one size fits all solution for how local communities can raise the funds that they need. There's certainly the opportunity for revenue generation through processes that towns already use. There's a lot of opportunity, and Martha might be able to speak more to this, around public-private partnerships, And I think that there's a lot of sort of untapped opportunity for private investment, tapping private markets, private capital for infrastructure projects, and that would involve a lot of public-private partnership work. So I think those are some opportunities. I think, again, it's important on the pipeline side, not to harp on this, but it's important to demonstrate that you have work that you want to get done, not just that someday, we'd like to get something done if the funding arises, but hey, these are the 4 or 5 things that we're actively seeking funding for and that are ready to go. That's as important as considering those funding streams in my mind. Roundabout answer to your question there, but hope that starts to get at it.
Just a comment about creating a pipeline of projects. It is very critical to be ready when the money hits the streets. So we're seeing a lot of federal programs now with putting a lot of money out there, like the BRIC program from FEMA. How do we access those funds? Well, part of the answer is communities need the capacity to engage on just starting to talk about getting that kind of money, and you can't do it alone. It's got to be a regional attempt. So the assistance that the Climate Council is recommending to give to communities and regions is going to be critical, because communities can't, there's just hardly, there's no capacity at the community level to say, okay, I'm going to spend the next week trying to coordinate with the 5 towns around me. That just doesn't happen at the regional level. You have to really carve out the reason why you need to do this, and you need technical assistance. And I think that the Climate Council's positioning of giving more technical assistance to communities is critical.
With BRIC in particular, Martha, FEMA wants to see those projects already in your hazard mitigation plan or your comprehensive plan. So you have to be thinking ahead of a couple of chess moves ahead here to get those projects positioned so that they're ready when federal funding comes. And knock on wood, we get some stimulus funding coming in the next 6 months or a year that could really, really be useful for communities to do the projects that they want to do if they're ready.
This conversation on BRIC is really timely, and I'm glad it's coming up. We did pose a question to FEMA headquarters about whether we could use BRIC funding for planning. There's some set aside for that, and could communities use that to identify nature-based solutions projects to include in their county hazard mitigation plans to queue them up? And I know they're fielding questions from across the country as it's a new program that's being rolled out, but that's one we put in the queue, and so hopefully we'll have some answers back about that.
Question from Jeremy.
So yeah, and I also wanted to just acknowledge that Christina is back on, so we'll take a question maybe from Jeremy, and then Christina, I want to give you a chance to get and share some more thoughts. So Jeremy, please, and then Christina will have you.
And I'll just be really quick. I'm the Planning and Development Director for the town of Camden. The hazard mitigation planning is pretty critical, and I will say, the town of Camden recognized that as an issue, and these county mitigation plans evolve. What we did, and we added it, we just did an addendum to our original, what we were including in the hazard mitigation plan to include climate change. And I think we're the only ones in the county that added that into the county mitigation plan. So I think it's critically important, as you all are saying, to do that and just try to be ahead of the game on it.
Thank you for sharing that, Jeremy. That's great to hear. And just again, other resources, examples of success on how to do this, people that are doing this work. Christina, please, I know you're jumping back in here, but if you might just say maybe, continue on your thoughts about where we're at. What does it mean to communities? Yeah.
I'm sorry. I guess it's a long way from Montana to Maine.
Yes, thank you for joining us
did any of
early in the morning.
Did we lose everything that I said? Or
no. You were talking about some the work that you've been involved with in models like from New Orleans and
Okay.
and how that can translate, like some lessons learned to the council, and again, how that really getting that back down to what does this mean for communities to set up themselves up for success.
Okay. I mean, my only point was that I think that what the plan the Climate Council comes up with should be something that helps communities decide for themselves. Our communities, and I, of course, agree with Representative Bloom, it should be groups of communities to the extent that's workable. But to figure out what they're vulnerable to and what kind of resources they have to undertake any one of a variety of solutions. I mean, there are solutions that are very expensive. You mentioned building hard sides. That's one. There are other things that are expensive, which is to move people away from harm's way. But every town has something different. And I think that the Climate Council is capable of coming up with a plan that would help communities figure out for themselves what they need. And then I think if you have one group of people who are enthusiastic, I was very charmed by what Representative Bloom said about the working groups in some communities that have tried to get started. And if you get somebody who gets started and you can encourage other citizens to take an interest, that's how it begins. I mean, it was in my town, Booth Bay, it was very interesting that people knew that the sea was rising. They wanted to do something about it, but it was just kind of a feeling. And there was no traction for it. And I think that this plan could give people a little traction. You have a lot of communities to guide. And I don't think the Climate Council ever imagined it was going to come up with a plan that applied to each and every town because we wrote it for them. It has to go the other way. And I also think we have to admit that sometimes they will think something is dangerous that isn't, but you have to let the local people work through that too. So I think, as I said to you before, my only worry about such slogans as shovel ready, I think that we have to be prepared. And the way to be prepared, I think, is what Brian said, that we've got to have some plans that really take on the question of what we need to be resilient against and what we think we can do. That's where the Climate Council can come up with a report that helps people. Because I think one doesn't want to just say we have a project that is shovel ready and it's worth a lot of money, so let's fund that. It has to be connected to a resiliency strategy, which doesn't mean a whole new plan. It can be just an overlay district. It can be something quite simple. And then the last thing, which I couldn't tell when I quit recording before, but I'm very interested in our recognizing something else. We are not simply trying to protect the people who are here now. I think that climate change is going to cause climate migration. People who live, I'll just take Louisiana because I know Louisiana, or Houston, or people who are living on the urban forest boundaries in California are going to start thinking, it's time to get out of here. I'm not going to survive here. And they'll be looking at states in the northern tier of this country. And Maine is already seeing extraordinary increases in property values. And so I think that's something we have to be thinking about, that as something likely. That's what my profession is in. We've been trained to do, to think about the future and future land use. And I think part of that is getting ready for it is that while we're thinking about moving people who are already here, who are in a danger zone, trying to encourage them to build on higher ground, or for new houses not to be built in the floodplain. At the same time, I think that we might want to use land use tools to increase the density of what's buildable on high ground. And that, for one thing, that's equitable. I don't think that people should think that because they're rich enough that they live on 2 acres away from where they won't be bothered by the climate change effects, that land has great value and it should be developed for more people. It's an equitable solution. I think one of the things I was really happy about the equity review that Brian is referring to is that it let people know that equitable means everybody is going to have to give up something. It isn't just that people who are living where they're going to be flooded out have to move. It's people who have been enjoying owning a lot of really prime ground that is safe are going to have to accept more neighbors. So that is what my profession is good at, and I think is what the Climate Council can really give some good guidance for.
Thank you so much, Christina. And actually, I will just say that that was some really culminating points, I think, that touched on a lot of the other items we were talking about, and call outs for community-driven planning and assessment, thinking about the long term, determine and to maybe reevaluate or reassess those projects, thinking again in the long term and about land use development, about equity, so I just really appreciate that. And we're actually coming up to the end of this segment, so I actually have some questions in the chat box, so perhaps we will have to follow up with you all about that. But I want to keep to the agenda, and I want to thank you all, Brian, Representative Bloom, Christina, for your presentations today, for really grounding us out and providing some great discussion. So really, thank you so much. And I'm going to hand it over to Victoria or Martha, I think, to just talk a little bit more about this next segment before we take a break.
Before Victoria starts, did I get cut off before I thanked Brian for all of his yeoman-like work, trying to put together a huge amount of information for that resiliency committee? And also to thank you, Nathan, for gathering us all together today, because I think it's really crucial to try to come up with what you call the how-to guides, which will translate the plan from the Climate Council to what people can use. So I'm afraid that got cut off, and I didn't. So if I'm repeating it, it's okay.
Thank yous, additional thank yous, yes, are much appreciated. Thank you, and to the project team, of course, on the how-to guides. I just want to make sure everyone knows we worked on those together as well. So, but thank you so much. All right, so I'm going to hand it over, Victoria, I think, or Martha. I think you might take us in this next section.
It's
Thanks.
me.
Great.
Thanks for mentioning the how-to guides, because that's a perfect transition to what I'm going to set us up for before we go into the breakout rooms after our break. So we just heard some strategies that are coming out of the Maine Climate Council that Brian presented, and to prepare us for climate change impacts. And we heard from Representative Bloom about some very concrete strategies that could be transferred to other communities that are working in York. We heard from Christina Ford about some of the deeper thinking that we need to do about why communities need to engage in preparing for climate change impacts. And part of that is being ready with a pipeline of projects for when the money hits the street, right? So I want to bring us back to what we did in workshop 1. Some of you were in that workshop, some of you were not. But the point of that workshop was to get your feedback on some of the challenges you face to fund and finance your climate adaptation projects. So a lot of times I feel like these workshops ask for feedback from community members and then nothing happens. So what Victoria and Nathan and I were really intent on doing is to not let your feedback go into the ozone and never get used. So we took your feedback and we put it into 3 buckets. We put it into 3 buckets that was meant to give information first to municipalities, second to the grant makers, and then finally to the Maine Climate Council. And you got that document yesterday with your agenda. If you had a chance to look at it, great. If not, don't worry, because we'll be going over that in our breakout sessions and discussing the feedback and seeing how we can even improve what is there, what's missing, and your impressions about would it be useful for the grant makers, for the Climate Council and municipalities to know what the communities are actually thinking in their own words. So I want to just refocus on the title of this workshop is setting your community up for success. And, you know, what I always think of is that there are so many strategies coming out of the Maine Climate Council, so many opportunities in front of us with some money coming out for resilience projects, but the challenges don't go away at the local level. So your feedback can really help us eliminate some of those challenges for the grant makers in the state of Maine, and also for what the Climate Council is ultimately going to recommend. The Climate Council got a lot of feedback on their surveys that they put out, but I think this feedback coming directly from the product of last workshop and this workshop can also really help us get there. So without more taking up more time, what we're going to do next is we're going to have a break. And after our break, we're going to be separated into breakout rooms randomly. There'll be a facilitator in each of those breakout rooms taking notes about the conversation and leading the conversation. And then when we come back to the common room, we'll report out on what happened in your breakout room. The facilitator will report out. And then we'll wrap up soon after that. So facilitators, when you get on into your breakout rooms, don't forget to hit record before you share your screen with your slides. And I believe our break is for 10, 15 minutes. Can somebody?
I think we're going till 10:15.
Great.
And actually, Leah, maybe you could just pull up the slide here with the break and the overview of that document.
Great.
That's great. Wow, lots of ideas covered. That was great. Martha, do you want to start us in on this, I guess, and then we'll go around the room?
Boy, that was a lot. But
yeah.
So we had a great discussion, mostly focusing on takeaways from this morning. And then we launched into talking a little bit about the bucket that was put together for the municipal officials, and then the bucket put together for the Climate Council. We never got to the bucket for grant providers, but some of the takeaways are that so the Climate Council has been great providing tools for communities for adaptations, and they also take into account, where communities are right now, but how is it going to be all financed? How are those recommendations and strategies going to be financed at the state level? How are communities going to get assistance to actually make changes at the local level? There's also a big need out there at the local level to help communities with grant writing and knowing what grants could apply to them. We also talked about what communities need in terms of technical assistance, in terms of prioritizing projects, and then knowing what funding opportunities are out there, applying for the funding and writing successful grants. The other thing that was we talked about was, what is the next version of the state support after December? What is going to happen in 2 years? What is going to happen in 5 years? Who's going to keep the momentum going that the Climate Council so well put together right now? There's great momentum. How is it going to be sustained? Let's see. So really, what is the implementation plan of the Climate Council? That's the big question that we ended up with. Easy.
Yep. Do you all want me to go next here, or Victoria or Alan? Do you feel inspired? Do you want to get your thoughts together?
I'm happy to go next if you'd like.
Great.
So again, Alan Kratz, and we had a very small group. It was Ashley Krulik from Falmouth, a new sustainability coordinator there, and Craig Olson from the Island Institute, who has served in just about every committee there is on Islesboro. And it was a really interesting discussion that we had, because all three of us realized that we're dealing on a municipal level, on a town level, with how to integrate climate adaptation into comprehensive plans. So we got down to some very specific details. Craig, for instance, mentioned that on Islesboro, there with the blowdowns, with trees falling and creating essentially a fire hazard. How does a town deal with that? What's the way to address this in a financially feasible way? And when we look at California and realize that we're talking maybe wildfires, I know they've been called climate fires. How do we deal with this imminent issue here in Maine? And is there some salvage value to these trees? Could they be converted into mulch? Is there a way of offsetting the cost of removing this? We got into these very detailed discussions and are also wondering, and maybe somebody can answer this in the chat or verbally, is there funding to pay for debris cleanup? Is this a new source of funding that we can look at? Perhaps as a result of what we're seeing nationally, this could become a source of funding. We also talked about what other things need to go into a climate plan for a town. It's certainly revetments, hard infrastructure to reduce the risk of flooding, for instance, but there's also the social needs. How do we provide better mobility for people, including senior citizens, so that they are not trapped in their home? How do we provide equitable transportation? It's electric vehicles, which runs the gamut from electric bikes, electric scooters, to what could even be the emerging market for electric pickup trucks. There's the whole range of electric vehicles that we need to be thinking about. One of the challenges in mobility is not simply the vehicles, but providing space along roads, which typically are narrow in rural communities, space for walking and biking as a way of environmentally moving ourselves around. And how do we encourage that? How do we facilitate that? That becomes a really challenging issue in rural communities with rural roads. We also talked about the real importance of regionalization, picking up on Representative Bloom's comment earlier. And, you know, there's that great example of the 6 municipalities in southern Maine. How do we facilitate that elsewhere? Craig mentioned that perhaps the 5 islands in Penobscot Bay could be thinking about regionalization, although the islands are very different. There are issues of commonality there. Toward the end of our discussion, we were, again, this is something we don't know an answer to, but are there, stepping away from climate change, are there programs, is there service delivery elsewhere in Maine that can be a model for regionalization, whether it's in the healthcare field, whether it's in the field of transportation, are there organizations that look in a broad regional way that can become a model for what we do in the climate change field? We didn't come up with any really. Perhaps land trusts are an example. There might be some tourism bureaus, chambers of commerce, but to the extent that we can find those examples elsewhere, those would be really good how-to tools for us on the very local level. So Craig and Ashley, if there's anything you'd like to add, I think I've hit the high points here. Feel free to, if you're not unmuted, unmute yourselves and jump in. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Nathan, whoever you want to voluntold next. Guess, Nathan, it's over to you.
Okay, sure. Victoria, you want me to go first here? Or
I'm happy to jump in.
okay, great.
I just sort of tried to look over and summarize. We had a great discussion. We have a new Regional Planning Commission director, a couple of development directors, one for an island community and one for a coastal community. We had a Maine Sea Grant staff person. I think that was it, but and then a Harpswell volunteer and Conservation Commission member. I'll start with the good things, the great things that are going on. There are a lot of great things going on. There are climate task forces that are happening in even the smallest of towns. There are comp plan updates coming down the pike that hopefully will be able to tap into the tools that trickle down from the Climate Council, tools and funding. There's some communities that are seeking large grant sources like BRIC and EDA funding. There's a climate resilience task force happening. I'll mention the community, I guess, in Harpswell. That report is going to the select board. And a lot of communities are doing some really, really good community outreach. So they're enlisting the broad support by the community to get everybody on the same page and ensure that people will vote for these projects and help them be implemented. The challenges, there are plenty of discussion, and we just sort of did an open roundtable discussion. Some regions around the state have a clear lack of regional planning support, and that needs to be changed right away, because our regional planners can really be the first lines in terms of offering technical assistance and grant seeking and all other kinds of things. We discussed that state agencies are often very disconnected with municipal government timelines and budget cycles. So there needs to be really more education and more, make sure that we sync up what those municipal needs and timelines are with what the state funding programs and cycles are. We talked about the need to look in a broad sense, I guess backing up what Christina was talking about, Christina Ford, and look at zoning limitations, height restrictions, for instance, making sure that those support or that there are variances granted to allow for sea level rise. We also talked about a disconnect between academic funding, such as institutions seeking multi-million-dollar funding like from the National Science Foundation, but a disconnect between those academic institution approaches and what the actual on-the-ground needs are in the local communities. How can we bridge that gap and allow for support from academic institutions and their expertise? Overall, a lack of training for code enforcement officers and other staff, municipal staff that often work part-time and have no background in planning and those kinds of issues. Look at not just sea level rise, but let's look at storm impacts in inland communities and how they're affected. Integrating resilience into county hazard mitigation plans. A lot of times there's a disconnect between the county hazard mitigation plans and climate resilience initiatives and resources. And then, sorry, just two more things. How to move from studies and assessments throughout the state and, moving to actual brick and mortar projects. How do we, let's do that. We're ready to do that. And finally, I guess ending on a positive note is, and this was borne out in our discussion that we had, is there's so much collaboration in Maine, like really impressive amount of collaboration in Maine. And the question is, how do we get those resources from all partners in the collaboration? How do we get the resources to where they're most needed and be really, really efficient? So that's what we covered, and it was a really fantastic group, and it reminded me that there's so much value in just the networking and open discussion like this. Thank you. So maybe I should ask, did I miss anything? I don't think I did, but anyone else? Okay, thank you.
I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up. Martha, you had something, yeah?
Sorry, I forgot to ask if any of my group wanted to add something out of my report, but then I realized I missed a half a page of things that I wanted to also mention. One thing I did not hear anybody else mention that we talked about was the need for education at the local level, and not only to the general public, which is so important but so difficult to achieve, but also to elected officials and representatives. And so we talked about some of the resources that can be tapped into to do that, including the ACCO, the Association of Climate Change Officers that is in Maryland. So that's one thing that I failed to mention. And then that some communities are forming climate councils, and that the citizens need to really understand what that means so that they can support it. And anything else, please, anybody in my group, please speak up if I didn't mention it.
Just giving a pause there. All right, hearing none so far. Yeah, for reporting out for our group, well, we did talk about some projects as are underway, and we also sort of talked about where the state of the how-to documents are and some ideas for improving them. Yeah, we had a really good discussion. I would say similar in some cases to others. It was very encouraging to hear that people are here today because they have a lot of work that is going on. They are also, in some cases, overwhelmed with where to start. They are also developing specific projects. So there's a big range on the scale of actions. We heard about things like comprehensive plans. We heard things about road work, increased attention on that. But sort of to focus on the documents a little bit, they seem helpful. However, they're still a bit listy, if you will. They, some of them, for example, the municipal document might be considered, just general government best practices. A lot of what we talked about also seem to be elevated into the funding the funders document and the Climate Council document, which were really trying to relay these issues along so that structurally there can be some changes to respond to these needs, and a lot of what was people already said. There could be a more focus on examples. Perhaps we could provide a lot of these examples along with this list to make it more actionable. While it is a helpful reference for, say, a municipal sustainability coordinator, department head, anybody who's working on this, to sort of reference as, okay, these are the things I might be doing. It's really important to point out the examples of who else is doing this. And so maybe that's something we could do as we look at these a little bit more closely. And that was one of the requests, is that we have more time to sit with them, that they be shared out, and some would like to share them with colleagues. They'd like to circulate it around other departments in their town, and they already are having these kinds of conversations, but they'd like to have be able to the devil's in the details. It was mentioned. We'd like to sit with these and have them in a Word format too, so where we can really make some comments. So I know that was already on our minds for the organizing team, so it was great to hear that, and that's definitely something we should be doing. It's, to also address some of the listiness of it, is it could be a little bit more step by step. Where do you start? And one of the big points that was brought up was we need to think more about understanding the risks, and thinking of, where are the risks and helping provide funding to communities to get around that question. And then that would prompt communities to connect as they understand where their commonalities of risks are. And then they can start working on solutions or working on those examples together. So that seemed like a foundational piece that was really important to highlight, is that while there is risk assessment happening, we can probably do more of it, and we need to think about funding for that work. That will help understand where land use development should or maybe shouldn't occur, but really prioritize where the investments are going to be made. So that there's certain things that we could do to sort of elevate and make this list into more of a step-by-step process, if you will. Yeah, there was a discussion about and again that sort of elevated into the funders and the council, and sort of how can funders provide the carrots, the incentives, and so forth for communities to even be able to do that by addressing their programs. That it will be really helpful to get this document in the hands of funding program managers at the state or other grant makers, so that they can sort of audit their own programs and say, am I doing these things? And that's really the intention. And so that's where these documents can go. But it was just sort of reiterated the importance of systemic sort of structural changes in the way that we're even using our sources and our funding sources in the first place. And I think that's probably I'll leave it there. I mean, a lot of the other ideas that we talked about were also talked about in other groups. I guess my last point would be, we could call out more specifically some specific issues that towns are having. So roads was mentioned. There's as a project that communities are really trying to grapple with. We could provide more examples of that, of the specific funding sources to access, or ways that communities can actually engage on how do we really get around our road infrastructure. That seems to be a very timely topic. There are some funding sources out there for that. We have a lot of best practices that can be provided as well. I'll just go back to Alan. You mentioned a question, which I have a little bit on, which is debris cleanup, disaster debris cleanup. DEP did put out guidance in terms of helping municipalities site their disaster debris locations. Those sites need to be, where you're hauling all of this debris. Those sites need to be pre-approved in order to receive FEMA funding after a disaster. So DEP is one of the review agencies on those sites. We did put out guidance a few years ago. We've been working with a handful of communities. It would be great if more communities were to get in touch with us. We have a form. It's just very short. We just need to know where the locations you're thinking of are. There's a few questions, but we can essentially pre-approve that, so that if there is a disaster and a town is seeking funding for reimbursement from FEMA, they already have that site pre-approved. And they can do that regionally with other towns. It helps us identify, if that site's in a floodplain, if it's has the capacity that can handle all of this debris. It also is really informative to understand who the haulers are. So if every town is contracting with the same group of small entities, we know from other states and what we've experienced in Maine that they can be really taxed and not available during an emergency when every town needs hauling of debris. So ways to create backups for that. So the short is there's funding if it's a disaster is declared. We also have this pre-approval process for a debris management plan. So I'd be happy to put people in touch with our staff on that. I think that's it. Anything else from my group that I missed?
I'll just quickly say thank you so much to everyone who participated. There's so much value in these discussions. And just to keep an eye open for word of our next workshop, which we hope will happen the end of this year or early next year. And we'd welcome input on what kind of content you're looking for, but the plan originally is to focus in more on how to enlist technical assistance and how to get partnerships going and how to, the nitty-gritty of crafting applications. But thank you again. And Martha, do you have anything more to say?
Unmute. Just that we so appreciate the time that you devoted to attending this morning, and we really value your feedback. We're going to take the feedback that we got today and add it to the 3 buckets, and we're going to try to organize those buckets so it's more accessible and more easy to understand. We might split it up in terms of needs, suggestions, and actions or something like that, and just try to make it more user-friendly. But the input you've given today is amazing, and we really, really appreciate your time. So thank you so much. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think we'll just make sure everybody has our contact information so you can be in touch with us, and we'll get those documents back out to you all for some further comments. Yeah, we just so appreciate it. It's been really helpful, and we hope we can help move the conversation forward and get the comments that you have been providing to those audiences. We know that they want to hear them, so we're happy to help facilitate that.
I just want to affirm the work that has been done by all of us on the Just want to affirm the work that the Maine Climate Council has been doing. It's really very important, and this has been a great opportunity. So lots going on in the local realm, and look forward to seeing the next workshop.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a great weekend, and thanks for spending time with us on a Friday. Have a great weekend. We'll talk soon.
Bye.